Pilatus has reopened the order book for its PC-24. It is continuing to work on certification for other runway surface types, including grass.
That's the speciality of all our aircraft, that they can land on, on dirt strips, on gravel, on grass, on snow. But it's more behind than you think. You have to certify those processes, and we did that all for the PC-24 now.
Every business jet needs the same thing to fly: a long, smooth, paved runway. No exceptions. Until now. The Pilatus PC-24.
Today I'm going to show you some unique capabilities of the Pilatus PC-24 that make it the first and only super versatile jet.
Is the first business jet ever certified to take off and land on grass, gravel, dirt, and even snow, opening up more than 20,000 airports worldwide that a typical jet could never touch. In Australia's outback, it's already flying medevac missions into strips other jets would consider impossible. So how did engineers build a jet tough enough to survive a dirt runway without losing the speed and comfort that make it a jet? Let's break down exactly how they pulled it off. The problem every business jet faced. Every business jet in the sky today shares the same quiet limitation. To take off and land safely, it needs a long, smooth, paved runway. Thousands of feet of reinforced concrete or asphalt, engineered specifically to handle the weight and speed of a jet-powered aircraft. That requirement sounds reasonable until you consider how few airports in the world actually meet it. Why does an entire category of aircraft, built to go anywhere fast, end up restricted to only a small fraction of the airstrips on the planet? The answer comes down to physics as much as infrastructure. A jet lands hot and heavy compared to a small propeller aircraft, and its narrow, high-pressure tires were never designed to handle loose gravel, soft dirt, or uneven grass. Land a typical business jet on the wrong surface, and the risk is not a bumpy ride. It is a genuine structural and safety hazard. So manufacturers built jets around the assumption that a proper runway would always be waiting at the other end, and airports built around the assumption that only jets meeting that standard would ever need to land there. That assumption works fine near major cities. It falls apart almost everywhere else. Vast stretches of the world, remote research stations, island communities, disaster zones, rural regions with no nearby infrastructure have never had the money or the population to justify building and maintaining a proper paved runway. For decades, if you needed real jet speed to reach one of those places, you were mostly out of luck. Turboprops and small propeller planes could make the trip.
Free turbine turboprop engine, reverse flow combustion path, air intake at rear, air directed to a compressor consisting of axial stages and centrifugal stage.
Jets, for the most part, could not. That gap between jet performance and bush plane toughness sat unresolved for a long time, treated almost as an unavoidable trade-off. Choose speed and comfort, and accept that your destinations would be limited to proper airports. Choose the ability to land almost anywhere, and accept the smaller cabin, the slower cruise speed, and the lower altitude of a propeller aircraft. Engineers at Pilatus, a Swiss aircraft manufacturer with a long history of building rugged, dependable planes, looked at that trade-off and decided it did not have to be permanent. That confidence did not come out of nowhere. Long before this jet existed, Pilatus had already built a reputation on rugged, short-field turboprop aircraft, capable of operating from demanding mountain strips and unforgiving terrain, the kind of flying most manufacturers avoided entirely. Applying that same design philosophy to a pressurized jet was less a leap of faith and more a natural next step for a company that had spent decades solving exactly this category of problem, just never before at jet speed. Part of what makes the paved runway requirement so limiting is simple economics. Building and maintaining a runway capable of handling jet traffic is expensive, requiring reinforced foundations, proper drainage, and ongoing upkeep that few remote communities or private landowners could ever justify funding. A grass strip or a graded dirt airstrip, by comparison, costs a fraction of that to establish and maintain. An aircraft that can safely use the cheaper option without sacrificing jet performance does not just expand where flying is possible, it expands where flying is affordable in the first place. What they eventually produced was not a compromise between the two categories. It was an aircraft that refused to accept the choice was necessary at all, a genuine business jet, pressurized and fast, that could still walk straight into the kind of terrain that had always belonged exclusively to bush planes. How do you design a jet tough enough to land on dirt without losing the speed and comfort that made it a jet in the first place? Built for the impossible, the Pilatus PC-24 earned its manufacturer's own nickname, the Super Versatile Jet, by becoming the first business jet ever certified to take off and land on short, unpaved runways, grass, gravel, dirt, and even snow-covered strips, in addition to the paved runways every other jet in its class depends on. That certification did not come from a single clever feature. It came from an aircraft engineered from the ground up around a different set of assumptions than the rest of its category. Start with the landing gear itself, reinforced and designed to absorb the impact and unevenness that loose gravel or a rough dirt strip delivers on every landing. Where a typical business jet's gear is optimized purely for smooth pavement, the PC-24's undercarriage was built with rough field operation as a core design requirement from day one, not an afterthought bolted on later. That single difference is a large part of why this aircraft can walk away from surfaces that would seriously damage a conventional jet. The tires themselves tell part of that same story. Rough field operation demands tires built to handle sharp stones, uneven surfaces, and repeated impact without failing. Paired with a suspension system engineered to soak up shock a paved runway would never generate. Every element of that undercarriage exists to answer one specific engineering question. How do you let a jet-weight aircraft strike an unpredictable surface over and over without compromising the safety of the landing? Debris presents a separate challenge entirely, one that has nothing to do with the landing gear at all. Loose gravel and dirt kicked up during a rough field takeoff or landing can be thrown into the air at speed, and a jet engine ingesting that debris is a serious risk most conventional business jets are never designed to tolerate. Engine placement matters here, and keeping the intakes positioned well clear of the surface, along with careful attention to how airflow moves around the fuselage during ground operations, separates an aircraft merely capable of touching down on gravel from one actually safe to operate there repeatedly. Stopping matters just as much as landing safely, particularly on a surface shorter and less predictable than a paved runway. Reliable braking performance on loose or uneven ground, combined with the aircraft's reverse thrust capability, gives the PC-24 the shorter stopping distances rough field operation demands, without which simply being able to touch down would not be nearly as useful in practice. Certification tells the rest of the story. Regulatory authorities do not hand out approval for this kind of operation lightly. The Pilatus PC-24 holds certification from both the United States Federal Aviation Administration.
So how come general and business aviation pilots are still communicating old school, talking directly to the tower, over a crowded radio? Way fewer miscommunications between pilots and controllers.
And the European Aviation Safety Agency for operations on dirt and gravel runways, with approval for grass and other surfaces following as testing expanded. Earning that sign-off means proving, under scrutiny, that the aircraft performs safely and predictably in conditions most jets are never even tested against. That testing process is far more demanding than a handful of demonstration flights. Certifying an aircraft for rough field operation typically involves repeated landings on the exact surfaces it is meant to handle, instrumented closely enough to measure structural stress, tire wear, and debris behavior under real conditions rather than theoretical modeling alone. Regulators are not simply taking a manufacturer's word for how the aircraft performs. They demand proof, landing after landing, before a certification like this is granted. The aircraft also holds certification for steep approaches, the kind required at airports with unusually short or challenging runways, the same category of approach used at tightly constrained city airports where a standard glide path will not fit. Combine that with rough field capability, and the PC-24 is not just tolerant of difficult airports, it is built to handle two of the hardest categories of runway limitation a jet can face: short length and unforgiving surface, at once. Is it any wonder pilots describe flying it into unconventional strips as feeling almost routine? None of that routine feeling happens by accident, either. Landing on an unfamiliar dirt or gravel strip carries a very different risk profile than landing on a runway a pilot has used 100 times before, with less predictable surface conditions and often less ground infrastructure. Every certification the aircraft carries represents hours of testing designed to make that unpredictable landing feel, from the cockpit, as close to routine as an inherently more demanding operation can feel. Published performance figures describe the aircraft as capable of operating from runways roughly 800 meters long, a fraction of what most business jets require, and short enough to fit airstrips never built with jet traffic in mind at all. Real-world runway needs shift with weight, altitude, and weather, the way they do for any aircraft, but the baseline capability alone reshapes what counts as a landable strip for a jet this size. Built for more than the runway certification only tells part of the story. An aircraft can be cleared to land somewhere and still be poorly suited to actually operate there once it arrives, and this is where the PC-24 separates itself from aircraft that were merely modified to survive rough fields. The rear cargo door is standard equipment on every PC-24 built, a feature almost unheard of in this class of business jet, allowing large or awkwardly shaped cargo to be loaded directly into the cabin rather than squeezed through a narrow passenger door. That door alone changes what the aircraft is capable of carrying, from medical stretchers to bulky equipment that would never fit through a conventional jet's entryway.
The jet is also able to rescue more people at once, with enough space to carry up to 3 stretchered patients and 2 medical teams.
Alongside it sits a separate luggage compartment, pressurized and accessible mid-flight, meaning the aircraft does not have to choose between passenger comfort and practical cargo capacity the way many jets in its class do. What good is a jet that can reach a remote strip if it cannot actually carry what that mission requires once it lands? That flexibility extends to the cabin itself, which can be reconfigured between missions rather than locked into a single fixed layout. The same aircraft that carries a full passenger load on one flight can be converted for cargo, for medical transport, or for a specialized mission on the next, without requiring a different airframe entirely. Few aircraft in this class are asked to be quite this many things, and fewer still manage it without meaningfully compromising any one of those roles. The cockpit reflects the same design philosophy. Called the Pilatus Advanced Cockpit Environment, it is certified for single-pilot operation, a deliberate choice that reduces workload and lets one well-trained pilot manage a flight that might otherwise require a full crew. For operators flying into remote or unconventional strips, where support infrastructure on the ground is often minimal or non-existent, having a cockpit designed to lighten the human workload in the air matters just as much as the landing gear underneath it. Single pilot certification is not a small technical footnote in an aircraft this capable. It means the systems, the displays, and the automation had to be designed specifically to prevent a single pilot from being overwhelmed during exactly the kind of high workload moment a rough field landing represents. Removing an entire second crew member from the cockpit only works if every other part of the aircraft compensates for that missing set of hands, and that compensation had to be engineered just as deliberately as the landing gear or the cargo door. None of these choices exist in isolation. The rugged landing gear, the rough field certification, the cargo door, the simplified cockpit, each one reinforces the others, building toward a single coherent purpose rather than a list of unrelated features. This is not a business jet with a few rough field modifications added afterward. It is an aircraft where every major design decision assumed, from the very beginning, that some of its missions would happen far from a conventional airport. That kind of ground-up commitment is rarer in aviation than it might sound. Plenty of manufacturers have modified existing jets after the fact, adding reinforced gear or minor tweaks to stretch an aircraft's capability slightly beyond its original design intent. Building an aircraft where rough field operation was baked into the original specification, rather than added as a retrofit years later, tends to produce a fundamentally more capable result. And it raises a fair question for anyone comparing options in this category. Would a jet designed primarily for pavement, then adapted afterward, ever really match one built around versatility from its very first blueprint? Where it actually goes. All of this engineering translates into a number that reshapes what a business jet is actually capable of reaching. The PC-24's rough field capability gives operators access to more than 20,000 airports worldwide, roughly double the number reachable by a typical business jet, limited to paved runways alone. That is not a marginal improvement. It is the difference between a jet confined to major hubs and regional airports, and one that can realistically consider strips most operators would never even research. Consider what that number actually opens up in practice. Island communities without the population or budget to maintain a paved runway. Research outposts built for function rather than convenience. Regions recovering from natural disasters, where existing infrastructure may be damaged or entirely unusable. Areas simply too remote to have ever justified paving a runway in the first place. For all of these places, the choice historically came down to slower propeller aircraft or no direct air access at all. That expanded reach cuts in both directions too. It is not only about remote strips with no infrastructure at all. The same steep approach and short field certification also opens the door to tightly constrained city airports that most business jets cannot use. The kind embedded close to downtown cores because they were never built to accommodate a full-length runway. An aircraft equally comfortable landing on a dirt strip in the middle of nowhere and threading a steep approach into a congested urban airport covers two extremes of difficulty almost no other jet in its class can claim at once. Before an aircraft like this existed, operators who genuinely needed rough field access had a narrow set of options, nearly all of them turboprops rather than jets. A King Air or a Cessna Caravan could land on the strip. Neither could match a jet's cruising speed or altitude once airborne. Operators were left splitting their fleets, keeping a turboprop on hand for the difficult legs of a trip, and a jet for everything else, accepting the inefficiency as simply the cost of doing business in remote locations. For business and private operators, the practical upside is more mundane but still significant, avoiding long ground transfers by flying directly into airports closer to a final destination, rather than landing at the nearest major hub and driving the rest of the way. Every additional airport a jet can safely use is time saved, and at the scale of 20,000 additional destinations, that time savings compounds across an entire operation rather than a single trip. Consider the alternative most business travelers have accepted without much thought: landing at the nearest major airport, then spending an hour or more on the ground covering the final stretch by car, simply because the destination never had a runway capable of handling a jet. An aircraft that can skip that final leg entirely does not just save time on paper. It removes an entire category of friction travelers have quietly tolerated for decades. Numbers like this are easy to state and harder to fully appreciate until they are placed side by side with the alternative. A conventional business jet operator plans a trip around where the pavement exists. A PC-24 operator plans around where the mission actually needs to go, with the runway question mostly settled before the trip even begins. How many industries and use cases have been quietly limited for decades simply because the aircraft available could not follow them where they needed to go? Charter operators and fractional ownership programs have taken particular notice of that shift, since expanded airport access translates directly into a wider set of destinations they can offer clients without needing a completely different aircraft type on standby. What once required choosing between a jet for the easy legs of a trip and a turboprop for the difficult ones can now, in a meaningful number of cases, be handled by a single aircraft capable of doing both. That consolidation matters beyond simple convenience. Operating two different aircraft types to cover both easy and difficult destinations carries real cost, in training, in maintenance, and in fleet complexity. An aircraft capable of covering both categories on its own does not just expand where an operator can fly, it simplifies the entire operation behind the scenes, reducing the kind of overhead that has historically made rough field access such a specialized, expensive capability to maintain. Looked at from far enough back, The shift is less about one aircraft's specifications and more about a changing assumption across the industry. For decades, aircraft capability quietly dictated where business could happen, with entire regions functioning as afterthoughts simply because nothing suitable could land there. An aircraft that erases much of that limitation does not just add destinations to a brochure, it nudges the industry's whole sense of what counts as reachable. The jet built for life-saving missions. Numbers and certifications explain what an aircraft can technically do. Real missions reveal whether that matters in practice, and few missions make the case as clearly as the work being done by Australia's Royal Flying Doctor Service.
Time is critical in an emergency, and now the Royal Flying Doctor Service is welcoming a brand new aircraft to its fleet.
Operating across some of the most remote territory on the planet, the organization has adopted the PC-24 specifically for medevac missions into short, unpaved outback airstrips that other aircraft in this performance class simply cannot reach. In that setting, every capability discussed so far stops being a marketing feature and becomes something closer to a matter of life and death. The rear cargo door that makes loading equipment easier also makes loading a stretcher faster, in exactly the moment where minutes matter most. The rough field landing gear that lets the aircraft touch down on a dirt strip is the same landing gear that puts a jet-speed aircraft within reach of a patient who would otherwise wait far longer for help. The organization itself was founded nearly a century ago, long before jets or reliable radios existed, built on the idea that distance alone should never decide whether someone survives a medical emergency. Generations of aircraft carried that mission forward since, each faster than the last, but always constrained by the same limitation: a proper runway the remotest patients almost never had nearby. The PC-24 represents the first time that constraint has been lifted at true jet speed rather than merely eased. The scale involved is difficult to overstate. Australia's interior contains some of the most sparsely populated territory on the planet, with communities separated by distances that would take many hours to cover by road, if a usable road exists at all. For patients there, the choice has never really been between a fast option and a slow one. It has been between an aircraft that can reach them and one that simply cannot, no matter how quickly it could fly if only the runway allowed it. Jet speed matters enormously in medical evacuation, cutting transit time dramatically compared to propeller aircraft over long outback distances. Before an aircraft like this existed, that speed advantage came bundled with a runway requirement that made it useless for most locations where patients needed help. The PC-24 closes that gap directly, delivering genuine jet performance to strips that would have disqualified almost any other aircraft in its class from attempting the mission. The math behind that speed advantage is straightforward, even without exact figures attached. A jet cruising well above where propeller aircraft typically operate covers the same distance in meaningfully less time. And in a medical emergency, that difference in transit time can be the entire difference between reaching proper care in time or not reaching it at all. Pairing that speed with the ability to land near the patient, rather than at the nearest paved airport hours away, is what turns a fast aircraft into a genuinely life-saving one. Every mission depends on close coordination between crews who understand exactly what the aircraft can and cannot do in a given set of conditions, since even a rough field certified jet still has real limits tied to weight, weather, and the specific strip involved. That coordination, built through repeated missions rather than theoretical capability alone, is part of why an aircraft like the PC-24 becomes trusted for this work rather than merely capable of it on paper. For a service built on the idea that no patient should be out of reach because of where they live, an aircraft finally capable of matching jet speed to remote terrain is not just an upgrade. It is the closest the mission has come to delivering on the promise it made when it first took flight, generations ago, with far slower aircraft and far greater limitations than crews face today. That is ultimately the clearest demonstration of why this aircraft was built the way it was. Impressive specifications are one thing. An aircraft that changes real outcomes for people who live far from a proper runway is another thing entirely. and it is difficult to find a more convincing proof of concept than a jet regularly landing on strips that would once have made this mission impossible to attempt at jet speed. Every business jet before this one made the same trade: speed and comfort, or the ability to actually get there. The Pilatus PC-24 refused to make that choice. Reinforced landing gear, rough field certification, a cargo door built for real missions, a cockpit designed for one pilot instead of two. Every piece exists to prove a jet does not have to stay grounded just because the runway isn't paved. More than 20,000 airports and real medevac missions across the outback later. That proof is hard to argue with. If this kind of engineering fascinates you, let us know in the comments. Share this with someone who loves aviation, and subscribe.